You don't marry someone her age, you settle for them," the groom said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. And just like that, the soft hum of the wedding hall shifted into something colder, sharper, as a few guests exchanged glances, then smirks, then quiet laughter that spread like a ripple across polished marble floors. And Margaret Hayes stood there in the center of it all, her white dress catching the glow of the overhead chandeliers, her hands trembling just enough to rustle the bouquet she had held with such hope only minutes ago. And for a moment she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, as if her dignity was trying to hold itself together in the silence between heartbeats. But the silence didn't last, because whispers followed, quick and careless. She waited too long. What did she expect? No man wants that kind of baggage. 3 voices, then 5, then more, each one landing heavier than the last, while near the back of the room, unnoticed by most, a man in a worn denim jacket stood beside a service panel he had just finished fixing, his toolbox still open at his feet, his young daughter holding his hand, her small fingers tightening as she looked up at him and whispered, "Dad, why is she crying?" Ethan Cole didn't answer right away, not because he didn't hear, but because he was watching, really watching, the way Margaret's shoulders tried to stay straight, the way her chin lifted just slightly like she refused to collapse in front of them, the way her eyes glistened but didn't fall, not yet, and something about that quiet strength settled deep in his chest, the kind that didn't shout, but didn't break either. And he took a slow breath, the kind you take before stepping into something you didn't plan for, the kind that carries weight. And then he moved, one step, then another, steady, unhurried, as the room continued to buzz with low laughter and judgment, his boots soft against the floor, his daughter walking beside him, confused but trusting. And when he reached her, he didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the groom, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and said quietly, "Hey, are you okay?" 3 simple words, spoken, without pity, without performance, just presence. And for the first time since the laughter began, something in the room shifted, barely noticeable, like the air itself paused to listen, while Margaret blinked, caught off guard not by the question but by the way it was asked, as if she were still worth asking, as if she hadn't just been reduced to a number, an age, a mistake. And for a brief second, the noise around them dulled, the whispers softened, and the light above didn't feel quite as cold, because someone, finally, had chosen to see her. And that was the moment everything began to change. Margaret did not answer right away, her fingers tightening around the stems of the bouquet as if it were the last thing anchoring her to the moment, her eyes searching Ethan's face like she was trying to understand why a stranger would step into a silence everyone else had chosen to ignore. And behind them the room continued its quiet judgment, a few guests shifting in their seats, a low chuckle slipping through the air, someone whispering, "This just keeps getting worse." But Ethan did not turn, did not react. He simply waited, steady, patient, the kind of stillness that did not demand a response but made space for one. And his daughter gently tugged at his sleeve again, her small voice softer this time. "She looks cold." And without hesitation Ethan slipped off his denim jacket and held it out. Not dramatically, not like a gesture meant to be seen, just a simple offering. "Here," he said. "You should not have to stand here like this." 3 sentences, quiet, even, and for a moment Margaret hesitated, her pride and her pain colliding in the space between them, the room watching now not with laughter but with curiosity. And then slowly, almost carefully, she reached out and took the jacket, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, a human contact that felt warmer than the lights above. And something in her expression shifted, not fully healed, not even close, but softened just enough to breathe. And Ethan nodded once, not as approval but as acknowledgement, like he understood more than she had said. And he glanced toward the empty dance floor where the music had long since stopped, the silence stretching awkwardly across the room. And then he looked back at her and asked, "Do you want to get out of here, or do you want to stay and prove them wrong?" A question that landed heavier than it sounded, because it was not about the room, not about the guests, not even about the wedding that had just unraveled. It was about her, about what she believed she was worth in a moment when everyone else had already decided for her. And Margaret swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not even know anymore." and a few people in the front row exchanged glances, one woman shaking her head as if the scene had become uncomfortable to watch. But Ethan remained where he was, grounded, unshaken. "Then start small," he said, his tone calm but certain. "Do not decide your whole life tonight. Just decide the next step." And his daughter stepped forward then, looking up at Margaret with the kind of honesty only children carry. "You can stand with us," she said. "You do not have to be alone." Three voices again, simple, unpolished, but real, and the air in the room shifted again, slower this time, like something unseen was beginning to settle, the laughter now gone, replaced by a quiet tension that no one could quite explain, and Margaret looked from the child to the man beside her, and for the first time since the night began, she did not feel like she was being measured, compared, or dismissed. She felt seen, and that feeling, fragile as it was, became the first step she had not expected to take. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because something unspoken had already broken the rhythm everyone expected, and now every glance, every shifting chair, every quiet breath seemed to circle around the three of them standing near the center of the floor, and from the side aisle a sharply dressed woman leaned toward another guest and whispered, "This is embarrassing," while a man near the front crossed his arms and muttered, "He is making a scene." Three judgments, quick and dismissive. And yet none of them were loud enough to overpower the quiet presence Ethan carried, because he did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply stood there beside Margaret like it was the most natural place in the world to be, and Margaret felt it, that steadiness, that refusal to step away even when the weight of the room pressed in, and for a moment her shoulders lowered just slightly, her grip on the bouquet loosening as if she no longer needed to hold on to something that had already let her go. And she looked at Ethan again, searching, uncertain. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice fragile but clear enough to cut through the lingering whispers, and he answered without hesitation. "Because someone should." Simple, direct, without explanation or performance. And that answer lingered in the air longer than any insult had, while across the room the former groom shifted uncomfortably. His earlier confidence dimmed now that the attention was no longer fully his, and a few guests who had laughed before now avoided eye contact, as if something about this moment was asking more of them than they were willing to give, and Ethan's daughter stepped closer to Margaret, her small hand gently touching the edge of the borrowed jacket. "You look nicer with this," she said with quiet sincerity. Three voices again, soft, but grounding, and Margaret let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized, her eyes glistening, not with humiliation this time, but with something closer to release, and the air in the room slowed, the low hum fading into a kind of waiting silence, and Ethan glanced toward the band area, where the musicians sat uncertain, their instruments untouched, the lead pianist looking as if he did not know whether to play or stay still, and Ethan made a small motion with his hand. Nothing commanding, just a suggestion, and the pianist hesitated, then pressed a single key, a soft note that barely carried across the room, followed by another, and another, until a gentle melody began to form, slow and uncertain at first, like the room itself learning how to breathe again, and Ethan turned back to Margaret, extending his hand once more, not rushed, not demanding, just present. "You do not have to decide anything big," he said quietly. "Just do not let this be the moment that defines you." And the words settled into her, not as pressure but as permission, and around them the last traces of laughter disappeared completely, replaced by something heavier, something closer to reflection, because no one was laughing now, no one was whispering. They were watching, and for the first time that night, they were not waiting for her to fail. They were waiting to see what she would choose. Margaret looked at his hand for a long moment, the soft piano notes drifting through the air like a question no one else dared to ask, and her breath caught somewhere between fear and something unfamiliar, something that felt like the beginning of courage, while around them the room held its stillness, guests frozen in half-formed judgments, glasses paused midair, conversations abandoned mid-sentence, and from the back someone whispered, "Is she really going to do this?" Another voice followed, quieter, less certain, "I do not think she can." Three doubts, quick and sharp, but they did not reach her the same way they had before, because now there was something standing between her and those voices, something steady, something real, and Ethan did not move his hand, did not urge her forward. He simply stood there, patient, as if he understood that this moment was not about him stepping in, but about her choosing to step out of what had just tried to define her. And his daughter looked up at Margaret again, her expression open and sincere. "It is just one step," she said softly. "You can take one step." 3 words, simple, almost weightless, and yet they landed deeper than anything else had that night. And Margaret felt it, that shift inside her, small but undeniable, like the first crack of light through a door that had been closed for too long. And slowly, carefully, she lifted her hand, not with confidence, not yet, but with intention, and placed it into Ethan's, her fingers trembling slightly as they settled into his steady grip. And for a brief second the world did not react, as if it needed time to understand what had just happened. And then the silence deepened, not empty, but full of eyes watching, full of thoughts changing, full of something no one had expected. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, not triumphant, not proud, just respectful. And he guided her one step forward onto the open floor, the space that had moments ago been a stage for humiliation, now becoming something else entirely. And the music grew a little stronger, still soft, still hesitant, but present. And Margaret felt the floor beneath her feet, solid, real, grounding in a way she had almost forgotten. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as the weight of the room began to lift, not because the people had changed, but because she had, just enough to stand differently, to breathe differently, to exist without shrinking. And from the side, the former groom shifted again, his expression tightening, not angry, not loud, just unsettled, as if he could not quite explain why this moment no longer belonged to him. And a woman near the front lowered her gaze, her earlier smirk gone, replaced with something closer to reflection. And Ethan spoke quietly, just for Margaret to hear. "You do not have to prove anything to them," he said. "Just do not forget who you are in a room that forgot how to see it." And the words settled into her like something she had needed for years, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just true. And as they began to move, slowly, simply, not even quite dancing yet, just stepping in time with the music, the room did something unexpected. It stopped judging, because it no longer knew how. And in that pause, in that quiet, something began to change that no one could take back. The music did not rush them. It did not try to fill the room with celebration. It simply lingered, soft and steady, like it understood that this was not a moment for performance, but for quiet rebuilding. And Ethan kept his movements simple, one step, then another, giving Margaret space to find her own rhythm, not leading too tightly, not pulling her forward, just enough to remind her that she was not standing alone anymore. And Margaret followed slowly, her breath still uneven at first, her fingers light in his hand as if she was not yet sure she deserved to be held there. But with each step something inside her began to settle, the noise of the room fading further into the background, replaced by the sound of the piano, the soft shuffle of their feet, and the steady presence beside her. And from the edge of the room a man shook his head quietly, whispering, "This is not going to last," while another woman beside him replied, less certain now, "I do not know." "Look at her." 3 voices again, but this time they carried doubt, not judgment. And Margaret heard it, not as pain, but as distance, like those words no longer reached the place inside her they once could. And Ethan glanced at her briefly, not to check, not to control, just to see. And he noticed the way her shoulders had lowered, the way her steps had grown more certain. And he spoke quietly, "You are doing just fine." And she let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh, not loud, not forced, just real. "I have not danced in years," she admitted, her voice softer now, less fragile. And he nodded once. "Then this counts as starting again." 3 words, simple, grounding, and the idea of starting again settled into her chest in a way she had not expected, not overwhelming, not impossible, just present. And the room watched, but differently now, the earlier tension giving way to something quieter, more reflective, as if each person was reconsidering what they had said, what they had believed, and what they were now seeing unfold in front of them. And near the front row a woman lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her glass, as if she suddenly felt out of place in her own judgment. while the former groom shifted again, his posture no longer confident, his expression uncertain, not because he had been confronted, but because he had been replaced in the center of the moment without a single raised voice. And Ethan's daughter stood just off the edge of the floor, watching them with a small smile, her eyes bright with something that looked like understanding far beyond her years, and Margaret noticed her. That quiet encouragement, that unspoken approval, and it steadied her even more. And as the music continued, something subtle but undeniable happened. Margaret straightened, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet dignity, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that simply exists, and the room felt it, even if no one said a word, because the woman they had dismissed minutes ago was no longer shrinking under their gaze. She was standing in it, moving through it, unafraid, and in that quiet transformation, without any grand declaration, without any dramatic confrontation, the balance of the room shifted completely, and for the first time that night, the people who had judged her were no longer certain they had been right. The rhythm between them grew steadier, not because the music changed, but because something inside Margaret had, her steps no longer hesitant but intentional, her posture no longer guarded but quietly open, and Ethan adjusted with her without a word, matching her pace, letting her lead just enough to feel in control of her own movement. And from the far side of the room a man leaned toward another and whispered, "He is still just a maintenance guy," while the other replied more slowly, "Maybe. But look at how he carries himself." 3 voices again. But now they searched for answers instead of delivering judgment, and that shift hung in the air like something fragile but undeniable, and Margaret noticed it, not directly, not in the words themselves, but in the absence of laughter, in the way eyes no longer dismissed her but studied her, and she exhaled softly, a breath that carried years of quiet doubt, and she looked at Ethan with a faint, almost surprised smile. "You are not what they expected," she said, her tone lighter now, and he gave a small shrug, his expression calm. "Neither are you." 3 words, simple, but they landed with a weight that felt like truth rather than comfort, and Margaret let out a quiet laugh, the sound unfamiliar but genuine, and the piano melody softened around them, wrapping the moment in something almost gentle, and near the edge of the dance floor Ethan's daughter spun once in place, her small shoes tapping lightly against the floor, as if she could feel the change even without understanding it, and Margaret watched her, that unfiltered joy, that absence of fear, and something inside her shifted. Again, deeper this time, not just a reaction to the moment, but a realization, and she spoke more clearly now. "I spent years thinking I missed my chance," her voice steady, not breaking, like life had already decided for me. And Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, just present, and after a brief pause he replied, "Life does not decide that, people do," he said quietly. "And people can be wrong." 3 sentences, measured, grounded, and they settled into her like something she had been waiting to hear but never had, and the room seemed to absorb it too, the silence growing not heavier but deeper, more attentive, and across the room the former groom shifted again, his earlier certainty replaced by something closer to discomfort, not loud, not visible to everyone, but present enough to change the way he stood. And a woman near the front lowered her glass completely now, her eyes fixed on Margaret with something that looked less like judgment and more like reconsideration, and the music continued, slow and unforced, and Ethan took one small step back, giving Margaret space, not stepping away, just allowing her to stand on her own for a moment, and she did, her hand still lightly in his, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze lifted, and for the first time that night she was not reacting to the room, she was existing within it on her own terms, and that quiet shift, almost invisible, carried more weight than anything said out loud, because it did not ask for approval, it did not seek validation, it simply was, and in that moment, without any announcement, without any dramatic change, the woman they had once dismissed was no longer defined by their words, she was defined by her own presence, and the room, whether it admitted it or not, began to feel that truth settle in. The space between them no longer felt fragile, it felt grounded, like something that had quietly taken root without asking for permission, and Margaret stood there not as someone being defended, but as someone being recognized, and Ethan sensed it, the shift in her posture, the steadiness in her breath, and he slowly released her hand, not as a withdrawal, but as trust, giving her the space to stand fully on her own. And for a brief second she hesitated, her fingers lingering in the air where his had been, as if testing whether the strength she felt would remain without him. And it did, and she straightened just slightly, her chin lifting not in defiance but in quiet certainty. And from the side of the room a man cleared his throat, speaking louder now. "This has gone far enough," while another voice followed, sharper. "She is making a spectacle of herself." 3 statements, firm, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative, but they landed differently now, not as authority, not as truth, just as noise, and Margaret turned her head slowly toward them, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm that had not been there before, and she took a small step forward on her own, away from Ethan, away from the place where she had been held, and into the center of the room where all eyes naturally followed, and the piano softened again, the notes stretching longer, thinner, as if even the music understood that something important was about to be said without words, and Ethan remained where he was, just behind her now, not leading, not shielding, simply present, his daughter standing beside him, watching with wide, steady eyes, and Margaret let the silence settle for a moment, long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for every whisper to fade completely, and then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying without force. "I believed you," she said, not pointing, not accusing, just stating. "For a long time, I believed what people said about when life is supposed to happen." 3 sentences, measured, honest, and the room listened, not because they agreed, but because they could not look away, and she took another breath, steady, grounded. "I thought I had missed it," she continued, "that there was a point where everything meaningful was already behind me." And a woman near the front lowered her eyes, her earlier judgment now replaced with something quieter, something closer to recognition, and Margaret's gaze moved gently across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, just acknowledging the space she stood in. "But I was wrong," she said finally, and those 3 words did not rise, did not demand attention, but they settled into the room with more weight than anything spoken before, and for a moment, no one responded, no one interrupted, because there was nothing to interrupt, and Ethan watched her, not with surprise, not with pride, just with quiet respect, because this was not his moment anymore. It was hers, and the people who had spoken earlier, who had laughed, who had judged, now stood still, their voices gone, their certainty gone, replaced by something they could not quite name, and in that stillness, without confrontation, without argument, Margaret did something no one had expected. She did not defend herself. She simply stood in her truth, and the room, for the first time that night, had no response. No one spoke after her words settled into the room, not because they agreed, not because they understood, but because something deeper had taken hold, something that did not allow easy reactions or quick judgments, and the silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, but full of realization, full of reflection, full of the quiet weight of truth that had just been placed gently in front of them. And Margaret stood there in the center of it all, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, no longer searching the room for acceptance, no longer bracing for rejection, simply standing, present, grounded. And from the far side of the room a woman shifted in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I think we were wrong," while another beside her nodded slowly, not speaking, just acknowledging what could no longer be ignored. 3 reactions again. But this time they carried humility instead of judgment, and Ethan watched from a few steps behind, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, because he knew this moment was not about proving anyone else wrong. It was about Margaret no longer believing she was, and his daughter stepped slightly forward, her small voice breaking the silence just enough to feel human again. "You look happy," she said softly, and Margaret turned toward her, surprised. For a moment, then something in her face softened completely, a real smile forming, not forced, not polite, but genuine, the kind that comes from something inside finally settling into place, and she nodded gently. "I think I am," she replied, her voice lighter now, and the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than anything dramatic could have, and the room felt it. The shift from tension to something quieter, something warmer. And the piano continued its soft melody, no longer hesitant, no longer unsure, as if it too had found its place in the moment. And Ethan took a small step closer again, not to lead, not to interrupt, just to stand beside her once more, and he spoke quietly. "You did not need saving," he said. "You just needed a moment to be seen." 3 sentences, steady, respectful, and Margaret looked at him, really looked this time, not as a stranger who stepped in, but as someone who understood without asking for anything in return, and she nodded slowly. The weight of everything that had just happened settling into something clear, something simple, and around them the guests no longer looked away, no longer whispered. They simply watched, some with softened expressions, some with lowered eyes, all of them quieter than before, because the certainty they had walked in with had been replaced by something else entirely, something that did not speak loudly but stayed. And as the music carried on and the room remained still, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman they had once dismissed had not changed to earn their respect. She had simply stopped believing she needed their permission to have it. And in that realization, without applause, without announcement, the entire room fell into a silence that finally understood what dignity looked like. The room did not return to noise. It did not rush back into chatter or applause. It stayed exactly where it was, suspended in that quiet understanding, as if everyone present knew that speaking too quickly would break something they had just begun to see. And Margaret stood there, no longer at the center of judgment, but at the center of her own calm, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing steady, her presence no longer asking for space, but naturally holding it. And Ethan remained beside her, not closer, not farther, just there, his daughter gently slipping her hand into Margaret's, a small gesture, simple and unplanned, but it carried a kind of acceptance that needed no explanation, and Margaret looked down at her, that small hand, warm and trusting, and something in her expression softened again, deeper this time, not just relief, not just gratitude, but something that felt like a beginning she had not allowed herself to imagine before. And from across the room a man, who had laughed earlier, cleared his throat but said nothing, while a woman who had whispered before now simply looked down, her reflection faintly visible in the glass she held. 3 reactions again, but this time they were silent, and that silence said more than their earlier words ever could. And Ethan glanced at Margaret, not to guide her, not to lead the moment forward, just to acknowledge it, and he spoke quietly. "You do not have to stay," he said. "You have already done enough." 3 sentences, calm, respectful, and Margaret considered it, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, something she had not felt in a long time. And she nodded slowly, not as agreement, but as understanding, and she took a small step forward, then another, not away from the room, not escaping, but moving through it with a quiet confidence that had not been there when she first walked in. And the guests shifted slightly to make space, not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but because something in her presence asked for it without saying a word. And as she passed, no one spoke, no one interrupted. They simply watched, their earlier certainty replaced with a quiet respect they could not quite explain. And Ethan and his daughter followed a step behind, not leading, not overshadowing, just accompanying. And as they reached the edge of the hall, Margaret paused for a moment, turning back just enough to look at the room one last time, not with resentment, not with regret, but with clarity. And she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to them, but to herself, as if closing something that no longer needed to stay open. And then she stepped forward again, toward the doors, toward the cool night air waiting just beyond. And as the doors opened and the soft sounds of the outside world slipped in, something inside her settled completely, not loudly, not dramatically, just fully. And behind her the room remained quiet, unchanged in its silence, because no one rushed to fill it, no one tried to reclaim it. They simply stood there, left with a truth they had not expected to face, that dignity does not arrive when others approve of it. It arrives the moment someone decides they no longer need that approval. And in that understanding, the entire room stayed still, not in judgment, not in confusion, but in a silence that finally knew what respect looked like.